Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. As I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution. You haven't read the Constitution? It says all persons.
I've got it right here. But
that moment from Capitol Hill is precisely why Senator Jeff Merkley's exchange with FBI Director Kash Patel spread like wildfire across the internet. Right after Patel claimed he understood the Fifth Amendment, Merkley struck hard. You haven't actually read the Constitution? It clearly says all persons. I have it right here. Patel left senators visibly shocked as he dodged straightforward questions about the FBI's involvement in America's aggressive deportation operations. This wasn't just catching someone off guard. It revealed something much more troubling.
I used to be, before I started doing everything, I was a public defender for years. I defended the worst humanity had to offer, including terrorists. And the one thing I learned in that job was, our due process and our Constitution applies to everyone, or it doesn't work. And that's exactly what our founding fathers wanted.
As the first former public defender to ever run the FBI, Patel should be standing up for due process. Instead, he came across as evasive and unprepared, refusing to clearly state that the Constitution's fundamental protections cover everyone on U.S. soil, including the hundreds of immigrants taken from the streets and quickly deported to El Salvador's infamous Cecot mega prison without any hearings. What's really going on inside the FBI under Patel's leadership? How can someone who swore to uphold the Constitution appear so unfamiliar with its most basic guarantee? And why does this constitutional ignorance surface exactly when hundreds of people are losing their rights? What came next only made things worse.
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so, as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us? What are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission and am in support of the budget here. And I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay.
This isn't the first time Kash Patel has shown major inconsistency before Congress. Just hours before this exchange, he forcefully requested another $1 billion for drug enforcement and counterterrorism. Yet when the actual budget was released, it proposed cutting $500 million. Caught in this glaring contradiction, Patel didn't give a direct response. Instead, he said he can't oppose what's given to him because rejecting it would mean supporting nothing. That's not leading. That's someone stuck in his own contradictions, speaking in circles. And this wasn't a one-time mistake. Senator Patty Murray criticized the FBI for submitting its legally required FY25 spending plan over a week late to Congress, calling the delay really absurd. Basic deadlines and congressional oversight apparently don't matter to this director. But the truly damaging moment came when Merkley pushed harder. According to House Appropriations Committee documents, the administration's FY 2026 plan proposed cutting $545 million from the FBI. When asked directly whether he wanted more funding or less, Patel wouldn't commit. No specific number, no accountability, just more vague talk about filling gaps. That same refusal to give straight answers about the budget is exactly the same approach that shaped everything that followed, especially when the Constitution itself was at stake.
Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says
doesn't
no person.
say that.
It does say no person.
What Kash Patel showed in that hearing goes way beyond one uncomfortable moment. It reveals a deliberate and dangerous shrinking of constitutional protections at the highest level of American law enforcement.
I am honored to be here in support of Donald J. Trump. He is being victimized, but we as a country are being victimized even more by the unconstitutional weaponization of justice and the two-tier system of justice that is on full display.
Patel wasn't simply staying quiet on an active investigation. He directly told a U.S. senator that he didn't know whether the Fifth Amendment applies to the hundreds of immigrants taken from American streets and sent to El Salvador's notorious Cecot mega prison without individual hearings. The Fifth Amendment doesn't limit due process only to citizens. For more than a century, the Supreme Court has consistently confirmed that the phrase "any person" in the Bill of Rights applies to every human being on U.S. soil, citizens and non-citizens alike. From Cecot versus Hopkins in 1886 through Reno versus Flores and beyond, the law has been perfectly clear. The government cannot simply grab people off the street, take away their freedom, and ship them to a foreign prison without any process. Yet Patel's evasive responses essentially treated due process as optional when the subjects are immigrants. As the first former public defender to run the FBI, Patel should be its strongest defender of these rights. Instead, by refusing to acknowledge the FBI's responsibility in investigating potential constitutional violations by other agencies, he's creating a massive loophole. This isn't abstract. Reports have documented cases where people with valid asylum claims, scheduled court dates, or even U.S. citizen family members were caught up in these operations, including the high-profile wrongful deportation of Maryland resident Kilmar Abrego Garcia under the revived Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a case that needed Supreme Court intervention. When the nation's top law enforcement official treats the Constitution's most basic protection as negotiable, it sends a dangerous message to every other government agency. Constitutional corners can be cut as long as the political target is unpopular. That's exactly how precedents for abuse are quietly established, one refusal to investigate at a time. And with Patel potentially having months or years left in the position, every American should be asking, how much further will this go?
Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it, because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status. The Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I'm more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me close with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
This hearing between Senator Jeff Merkley and FBI Director Kash Patel did more than expose one difficult moment. It uncovered a deeper disconnect between the person leading America's top law enforcement agency and the constitutional principles that agency is supposed to protect. Patel's defense followed a familiar pattern seen across multiple high-profile appearances this year. He first claimed superior knowledge of due process compared to any previous director, then shifted blame by describing the deportations as simply a different branch of government. Merkley immediately pointed out the problem. If the FBI refuses to investigate potential constitutional violations simply because another agency carried them out, then no part of federal law enforcement remains accountable. That's not a minor legal distinction. It's a broad exemption being created right now. When pushed to make a clear commitment, Patel eventually stated that due process would be honored under his leadership. Yet that promise only came after repeated questioning and only after being reminded on the record of the plain text of the Constitution he swore to defend. For someone who entered the role emphasizing his background as a public defender, the exchange raised serious questions about consistency between past advocacy and current institutional responsibility. The bigger significance lies in what this reveals about the current direction of the FBI. For decades, the Bureau's credibility has rested on two pillars: operational effectiveness against crime and terrorism, and consistent respect for constitutional limits. When those two pillars begin to separate, public confidence weakens. Career professionals inside the agency who have built their careers around careful adherence to legal standards now see their director treating one of the Constitution's core protections as something that can be handled case by case, depending on the political situation. This moment stands out from earlier controversies because the position was stated openly before a congressional committee rather than through classified programs or after-the-fact interpretations. By declining to confirm the FBI's role in examining potential violations of due process by other agencies, Patel effectively suggested that large-scale enforcement operations can operate in a zone where constitutional compliance is treated as optional. That message travels far beyond one hearing room. It reaches agents in field offices, officials in partner agencies, and judges who will eventually review these actions in court. The practical consequences are already visible. Families have been separated during rapid operations. People with pending asylum claims or court dates have been removed. In several documented instances, mistakes were only corrected after judicial intervention or later review. Each case represents not only a human story, but also an institutional failure. If the FBI, the agency best positioned to investigate potential civil rights violations, chooses to stand aside. When courts later examine these operations, as they inevitably will, the absence of parallel FBI review leaves the Bureau appearing detached from its own constitutional oversight responsibilities. Congress still has important tools to address this. Through continued oversight hearings, targeted budget provisions, and legal requirements for reporting, lawmakers can reinforce the expectation that due process is not optional for any federal agency. The judicial branch continues to serve as the ultimate check it has always been in American governance. However, these mechanisms work best when the executive branch's senior law enforcement official actively supports rather than sidesteps them. For everyday Americans, the lesson is simple. The Constitution was deliberately designed with safeguards because concentrated power tends to expand when left unchecked. Its protections aren't reserved for popular causes or convenient moments. They're most important precisely when applied to groups with limited political influence. When those safeguards begin to be treated as flexible, the real question isn't whether the system will eventually correct course. It's how much precedent is established and how much trust is lost before correction happens. Patel entered the role with a public commitment to restore integrity and focus to the FBI after years of controversy. This hearing, however, showed an agency still struggling with fundamental questions about the scope of constitutional obligations. The gap between stated intentions and actual performance is what makes this moment significant. It's not simply about one set of answers on one afternoon in Washington. It's about whether the institution Patel leads will continue to be regarded as a consistent guardian of the rule of law, or whether it risks being perceived as selective in when and how it applies constitutional standards. Further congressional review, ongoing litigation, and public scrutiny will provide more clarity in the months ahead. What remains to be seen is whether the FBI under current leadership will move decisively to reaffirm its role as a defender of constitutional boundaries across all enforcement activities, regardless of political context. Every American, regardless of background or political perspective, has an interest in the outcome. The Constitution doesn't belong to whichever party holds power at any given time. It belongs to the country as a whole. The central question this hearing leaves us with is whether we will continue to insist that its core protections apply equally, especially when doing so requires holding our own institutions accountable. That standard has served the nation through many challenges before, and it remains the surest foundation for public trust in law enforcement going forward. If this hearing raised important questions for you about leadership at the FBI and constitutional accountability, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We'll continue following these developments with detailed, fact-based reporting. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of this exchange stood out most to you? We read every comment and often draw from them for future coverage. Thank you for watching.